So I'm delighted to be back. Thank you all so much. I know that last time was a bit of a gallop through a lot of context. I hope that I didn't leave you all with historical whiplash with all of that. We had to really cover a lot of ground to actually get into chronology, but I think this time I hope to slow down and go a little bit more in depth with primary source material. Just to briefly summarize last time, we examined 250 years worth of developments, social and political and economic developments that got us up to the point in time of the election of 1860, the election that splits the nation apart. I realize I never actually told you who won the election here in Lauderdale County. Lauderdale County voted for Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, who is arguably the most moderate person in the race in 1860, but actually all of the election precincts in Lauderdale County, at least one candidate carried at least one precinct. So it's important to know, as the nation is divided, we saw how Alabama was divided north from south over the issue of secession, and Lauderdale County is also hotly divided politically amongst themselves. The other thing I was going to mention that I didn't mention last time is about 10% of all people who were enslaved in Lauderdale County were held in bondage by just 4 individuals. 4 men enslaved 10% of all the enslaved people in Lauderdale County. So examining these demographics is so important whenever we start getting into the events that take place here, and understanding that it's a far cry from unanimity as we go into things, which explains really the chaos that follows. First of all, I want to give a shout out to a man named Adolf Metzner, who is an artist attached to the 32nd Indiana Regiment. I'm going to heavily feature his artworks today in my presentation. Adolf Metzner was a German-born individual. He was a pharmacist by trade, but as he moves through the shoals in the Tennessee Valley in the summer of 1862, he captures these really gorgeous pencil images, and some of these are just on little scraps of cardboard that he found lying around that he had at hand. But in the absence of photographs of the shoals at this time, Metzner's drawings are really so vivid and lifelike, and they capture such a great an impression of what life would have been like here. Actually, in this scene, I'll go ahead and point out, you see the steamboat, obviously, but this is a steamboat at the Florence Landing at what we call McFarland Park. Up on the hill, you can barely see it, so faint, would be the city courthouse and the spires of probably the Presbyterian Church, but that's a view of Florence looking north and northeast. Now today, as I say, we'll really slow down and look only at the events of 1862. 1862 is such an interesting year to me, and I mean, it's all interesting to me, obviously, but we really start to see people waking up to what this war is going to be. It starts out really, there's this sense of naivete, as we saw last time, of boys thinking that they're going off to glorious fields of battle to win reputations and favor among the ladies on these glorious far fields of battle. But then as the war really starts to get down to the nitty-gritty tooth and nail, people wake up to the slaughter and the struggle that's at hand. And 1862 is really the year that wakes people up to this, as we will see. And really a development in the character of warfare as well, as you go from having boys who are green recruits who have never fired a gun in battle to the making of seasoned veterans and seasoned generals, the men who eventually will put an end to this. In the spring of 1865, men like Ulysses S. Grant, they are going to really cut their teeth on the war here in the Tennessee Valley in the year 1862. This is our roadmap. After so much context last time, I gave you a lot of summary, but we're going to really start to get into chronology today. I'm going to go event by event and present really a fluid narrative, and we'll see the progression, how one event really leads to another and snowballs to a federal presence here at the shoals of the Tennessee Valley. I will say, however, I have to put a disclaimer on this. As we talk about events flowing into one another, there is a temptation to see these events as almost inevitable, right? Like it had to happen this way. And it's us being blinded by hindsight. We have to remember that really anything could have happened. and what we call the contingency of history, right? That even though I present a logical flow of events, really at any point, anything differently could have happened. So none of this is inevitable. This is a map that I created that we looked at last time. I'm going to use it to sort of ground in our minds some of the places that we're talking about and their geographical relationship with one another. The first is Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. This is a Confederate fortress. You'll notice it sits just right here where there's a tiny little boot heel in the state of Tennessee where it meets the state of Kentucky. The Tennessee River and the Cumberland River flow really close together. I think it's just like 7 or 8 miles at the narrowest point. But the reason that Fort Henry is constructed here is because Kentucky maintains its neutrality throughout the war. And so whenever Tennessee secedes and joins the Confederacy, this is the gateway to the Confederacy of neutral Kentucky and Confederate-held Tennessee. That's why they build the fort where they do. And then secondly, Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which guards the approaches to Nashville. Further up the river, up the Tennessee at number 4, this is Pittsburgh Landing, where the Battle of Shiloh takes place in April 1862. And then 3, I have marked Bear Creek, because the railroad trestle over Bear Creek in modern-day Colbert County, Alabama, is strategically significant to the Federal Army in March 1862. And it's part of the reason why they begin massing here at Pittsburgh Landing in an attempt to try and take this strategic railroad hub of Corinth. Now, as I said, Kentucky was maintaining its neutrality, but very quickly in the end of 1861, the Confederates occupy 2 key points. They occupy Columbus, Kentucky, and Bowling Green, Kentucky, to sort of pad their front along the line of the state of Tennessee. And in response, the Federal Army under Ulysses S. Grant takes Paducah. And as I mentioned last time, whenever Grant and the Federals take Paducah at the mouth of the Tennessee River, citizens in North Alabama realize that they've got a problem, because the Tennessee River now is open to incursion by gunboat. And at any moment, it seemed, the Federal Army could ascend the Tennessee River and occupy the shoals. Now, the one thing that's preventing them really from doing that is Fort Henry. Now, in November 1861, a delegation of prominent citizens from North Alabama met with Confederate General Gideon Pillow at Fort Henry, and they asked him, to be honest with them, give us the state of things. How is Fort Henry looking, General? And Gideon Pillow said, in regard to the question, do I consider the Tennessee River safe? I answer unhesitatingly that I do not. And so these prominent citizens decide to organize and send out a circular letter throughout North Alabama calling on men to join regiments. And their circular letter has some curious details that I'll read to you here. They say, we propose to organize a company of old men armed in each county in North Alabama for 40 days. Our reasons for this are that they are in general not only better marksmen than the generation now growing up, but the very fact of gray-headed men moving to the field will give an impetus to volunteering, which we need just now. So they have this psychological consideration. Well, maybe if the young guys see all these old men volunteering, then they'll join more enthusiastically than they have been previously. But so they call on arming 5,000 men, which is a huge proportion of the white population in the Tennessee Valley at this time. It's important to note as well, they say, we have applied to the governor for the purchase of arms and the compressment when necessary, giving power to impress Negro men when necessary to labor on the public works. So not only are they calling for volunteers to join regiments to go and man Fort Henry, but they're calling on slaveholders to send their enslaved people to Fort Henry to labor to shore up the fortification. Because by New Year's 1861-62, it was apparent that Fort Henry was a doomed location. Now, I have tried to find the exact moment in time when Fort Henry was constructed. I can't find pinpointing when that happened, but it had to be sometime during the summer of 1861, right as Tennessee is seceding from the Union. Now, why this is significant? Fort Henry is built on a floodplain of the Tennessee River. And I think in the summer of 61, while the water was so low, they built the fortress without realizing what was going to happen in February and March when the rains came again. So by February 1862, there's 3 feet of water standing inside this fortress. And the man left in charge of it, Lloyd Tillman, realizes that it's a doomed position. So by the first week of February 1862, these federal gunboats that have been stationed in and around Paducah, Kentucky, have been getting a feel for the Confederate position at Fort Henry, sending little expeditions up to observe them, exchanging a few shots. But the federal commander of naval forces in the West for the Union Army is Admiral Andrew Hull Foote. And he leads a gunboat squadron, February 6, 1862, to bombard Fort Henry. It was supposed to be a 2-pronged attack. General Grant and General McClernand would go overland and attack the fortress by land while the gunboats bombarded from the river. Now I say it's supposed to be because the gunboats bombarded Fort Henry for about 75 minutes before the flag inside the fort was hauled down. The Confederates had basically already given up on holding Fort Henry. They had moved the bulk of their forces over to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, which guarded the approaches to Nashville, which is situated 200 feet above the river on a bluff. So a much more strategically advisable location. And it also guarded the capital to Tennessee, so it's a much more strategic location in the long run. So the Confederates had basically given up on Fort Henry anyway, and before the land forces can even get there, the fort has surrendered to the gunboat flotilla. And these are a couple of contemporary depictions, I think from Harper's Weekly, these engravings and lithographs showing the bombardment of Fort Henry. Now, it's a stunning and celebrated victory for the Union Army. It's amplified and magnified in the Northern press as really the first victory for the Union Army in the entire war. Remember, back in 1861 at Bull Run, the Union Army is knocked out of the war in the East, and they really are knocked off their feet to the point that they don't get back up for the rest of 61. So the war heats up here in the West and gives the Northern public really its first cause célèbre of the war, which is the capture of Fort Henry. It's not a victory for the Union that's completely without scarring, however. One of the gunboats received a mortar shell through its boiler, the gunboat Essex, and exploded and killed its lieutenant. So the Union Army also suffers at Fort Henry, despite the fact that it's really a very compelling victory. Now, for Florence and the Shoals, the most interesting and palpable impact that came out of the capture of Fort Henry is the subsequent gunboat expedition that ascended the Tennessee River to the Shoals. This is a map that I created a few years ago showing you the route of this gunboat expedition. Now, after Fort Henry capitulates, after it surrenders to the Union Army, some rebel gunboats, rebel steamers and transports make a hot getaway back up the river, back into Confederate territory. And General Grant, commander of Union forces at Fort Henry, orders a small flotilla of gunboats, the Lexington, Conestoga, and then also the Tyler, under command of this man, Seth Ledyard Phelps, to chase them, to capture them if possible, and also to disable this railroad bridge near Paris, Tennessee, where the railroad crossed the Tennessee River near the mouth of the Duck River. Well, Phelps and the men give chase. They chase the Confederate steamers up the river. When they get to the railroad bridge, they find that the Confederates have scuttled the bridge to prevent them from going any further up the river. So Phelps and his men repair the bridge, and they continue pursuing the Confederate gunboats all the way past Clifton, past Cerro Gordo, past Savannah, and they enter the state of Alabama on the morning of February 8th, 1862. And they make it all the way to the Florence Wharf. And whenever they come within sight of the city of Florence, the local Confederate authorities there actually scuttled the transport steamers and a lot of the military stores on the wharf. They burned the warehouses there in a preemptive effort to keep those war material from falling into the hands of the Union Army here. And to my reckoning, when Phelps and his men set foot on the Florence steamboat landing on the morning of February 8th, 1862, they are the first Union soldiers to set foot on the seceded state of Alabama after the war had begun. This is February 8th, 1862. Now, there's definitely a variety of perspectives that emerge from this event. The Florence Gazette is still publishing at this time, and this is their account of Phelps's visit to their wharf that morning. The Florence Gazette said, "On Saturday last, our citizens were thrown into the utmost state of excitement by the appearance of 2 Yankee gunboats, the black, ugly things wrapped as they were in the habiliments of death and mourning. Landing was made. One of the warehouses was opened without a key, and such articles as were supposed to belong to the Confederate States were taken. Private property, we were informed, was respected. A courteous interview took place between the commander of the expedition and a deputation of our citizens, in which the citizens of the town were assured that violence was not intended to person or property of peaceful citizens. We believe this pledge was kept, and soon after the sable shades of night were drawn over this sad spectacle, the cables were loosed, and the demons of an abused power went steaming down the river. We were honestly told that we might expect them again." Nobody writes like that anymore. Now, from all accounts, however, though, Phelps and his men were on very good behavior whenever they were in the city of Florence. Phelps says in his official report that he was met by a deputation of citizens from the town, and the citizens had 2 requests. The first request was that they might be able to, quote, quiet the fears of their wives and daughters that they should not be molested. And secondly, that Phelps please not destroy the railroad bridge. Those were the 2 things. And Phelps told them that they were neither ruffians nor savages, that they were there to enforce the law and to protect them from violence. And he didn't see that the railroad bridge had any military significance from his perspective, so he spared the bridge. Now, Phelps, in his official report, is just over the moon with reports of what he calls gratifying proofs of loyalty from the citizens living in the town and along the river. He says, "I now come to the most interesting portion of my report. We have met with the most gratifying proofs of loyalty everywhere across Tennessee, and in the portions of Mississippi and Alabama, we visited the most affecting instances, greeted us almost hourly. Men, women, and children several times gathered in crowds of hundreds, shouted their welcome, and hailed their national flag with an enthusiasm there was no mistaking. It was genuine and heartfelt. These people braved everything to go to the riverbank, where a sight of their flag might once more be enjoyed, and they have experienced, as they related, every possible form of persecution. Tears flowed freely down the cheeks of men as well as women." He says that he and his men were stunned by the sight of these open displays of Union sentiment so deep in Confederate territory, and that it gave them an almost spiritual purpose for what they were doing. Now, to be fair, I don't know how much of this is overwrought rhetoric. I really don't know how much of this is an embellishment on Phelps's perspective to make their mission seem the more important. But his report is really amplified in the Northern press. The Times-Union of Brooklyn, New York reported, quote, "The people of Florence are so delighted at finding the Stars and Stripes one more giving protection to them that they were prepared to give a grand ball to the officers of the gunboats, but they could not remain to accept their courtesies." Phelps never says anything about being invited to a ball. I think that the newspaper writers probably just gave a fine embellishment to that and didn't think that anyone would call their bluff. Didn't think that a historian 160 years later would find some holes in that narration. Now, I will say, though, 2 Unionists living in and around the Tennessee River at this time, this was a monumentous event. This was a glimpse that perhaps there was hope for their cause. Among them was a man, Thomas Jefferson Seipert, who lived in Cypress in Tennessee. He will be instrumental in organizing a loyal Union regiment of men from Wayne County, Lawrence County, Alabama, Hardin County, Tennessee, Lawrence County, Tennessee, and Lauderdale County, called the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry. Seipert says that whenever the gunboats came down the Tennessee River in February 1862, all the country between our places and the river was the scene of the wildest excitement, that the Union people had their banners up and were shouting beneath them, while the secessionists were running in every direction except towards the river. He says that it gave them the option to organize and to actually talk about, okay, what can we actually do here? So this is actually a screenshot of the Florence Gazette that morning, 2 Yankee gunboats at our landing, citizens leaving. It caused great excitement in the area, but it's really a short-lived moment in time. Fort Henry is really overshadowed by the event which happens next, the capture of Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River.